Okay. Now I lost where I was. What was the last thing I was saying? No. I mean on the tape.
About the animosity.
Oh, the animosity. Right. That animosity will stand right up until God's back and kills all the unbelievers at his return who are waging war to the point of, their only goal is to destroy and kill the Israelites. And he's going to save Israel from destruction. And there will be believers, pockets of believers in every nation, including every Arab nation. There will be pockets of believers. And only then will the animosity be completely washed away and wiped away. And of course, during the tribulation, when people believe in the gospel of the kingdom preached to them, in their own hearts there'll probably be no animosity at that point between the Jews. But the animosity will still look like it's there because each of the nations will be still raging against the Israelites. But it's only in Christ ever that the animosity will ever be gone. Okay, now, my point here is that these descendants that are promised this land, what we want to see here is exactly who those descendants are and who those people are that belong to that land. It isn't all the descendants of Abram, even though here you could make a case for it if you took this by itself out of context. Who are the other nations that are going to be blessed by this one nation? These descendants comprise one nation through whom the nations of the earth will be blessed, and the families of the earth will be blessed. So the context even of this passage tells us it's one nation, one group of descendants, not all the descendants. But let's go on and see what that is. Now, chapter 13, verses 14 through 18, it says, and we're skipping all kinds of good stuff, but it's not immediately pertinent to our concern here, so we'll just kind of go through here and pick out the pertinent portions. Chapter 13, verses 14 through 18, it says, And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, Now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all the land which you see I will give to you and to your descendants forever. Now again, we haven't yet defined who those descendants are, but this is the land of promise that he is going to give to these as far as they can see, and in fact even farther they can see for a fact. He says, I'll make your descendants as the dust of the earth. In other words, it'll be a great number of descendants, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. The point isn't that they will actually be the number of every little grain of dust or grain of sand, etc., but simply that there'll be so many that it would be virtually impossible to actually number them. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. Then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Chapter 15 now, verses 1 through 21. The whole chapter, it says, After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram. Remember, he still doesn't have any kids. These promises to his descendants that are going to be numberless virtually. He doesn't even have one child yet. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, Do not fear, Abram, I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great. And Abram said, O Lord God, what wilt thou give me, since I am childless? And heir of my house, the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Since thou hast given no offspring to me, one born of my house is my heir. So one of his servants had a child. He's saying, I guess by their custom, if the master of the house had no children, then the heir is somebody else born in his house, even though it was a servant. Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, This man will not be your heir, but one who shall come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. And he took him outside and said, Now look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, So shall your descendants be. Now, by the way, the point isn't that they are an infinite number, because that's by definition impossible. Because if there was an infinite number that would be infinity, how could that be? It's a finite number, and there are a finite number of stars. There are not an infinite number of stars, or the universe would be infinite, and that would make the universe itself God, and God, who is infinite, would be at least only equal with, but not greater than his own creation. The creation is finite. A lot of Christians even wrongly believe that the universe is infinite. It is not. It has a limit. In fact, its limit is encompassed, enclosed, if you will, by this water shell with the waters above, separated from the waters below by the expanse, or what we call the universe. The King James calls it the firmament, in which the sun, the moon, and the stars are. It's a finite number there, but it's a great number, and so your descendants shall be. Hard to count. There'll be so many of them. He says, I don't even have a child. And we're going to, I'm telling you, you're going to have descendants that are going to number like that. Then he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned to him as, God, reckoned that belief in Abram to him as righteousness. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. And he said, O Lord God, how may I know that I shall possess it? And he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a young pigeon. Then he brought all these to him and cut them in two and laid, animal rights people aren't going to like that. And laid each half opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. And the birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abram drove them away. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. And God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. Now, because you see, we've already read the story. You know, if we just, first time in our lives we ever read this, we wouldn't know what that was talking about. This is a prophecy of the future of his specific descendants that he's talking about here. The descendants that will be the land. It will be the heirs of this land of promise. Now, what is that talking about?
Not the Arabs.
No, not the Arabs. But what is he talking about? When he says your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they'll be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years, what is that? What is that place they're going to be? Egypt. They were enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. Who was enslaved in Egypt for 400 years? The descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel, were in the land of Egypt for 400 years, which when they started there, it started with Joseph going there and getting a high place ultimately after going through a lot of trouble to get there. Ended up at a high place in government, which then saved his family from famine when they came looking for food, and then he revealed himself. You know the whole story about Joseph and his brothers. And then they went and got the dad and brought him back, Jacob, and brought him back to Egypt. And they survived there, but in the process, they didn't go back for a total of 400 years. I mean, there was 40 years before they came back out of Egypt. But when they came back out of Egypt, they went from being, I've forgotten how many it was, 120 people, to millions. A couple of million came out of Egypt. God made them in a great nation, a land that was not theirs, where they had been enslaved. This is a prophecy, way before it happened, of that coming event. It says, verse 14 now, but God will also judge the nation whom they will serve. That's the Egyptians. And afterward they will come out with many possessions. And they left with great wealth. Even though they've been enslaved all that time, the way God did it, when they left with much booty. They had lots of stuff. And as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, Abram. You shall be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they shall return here to this land of promise. Who's going to return there? These descendants that he's talking about here. But we're not talking about any of the Arabs. We're talking about the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob's name, we'll see a little later, was changed from Jacob to Israel. So the Israelites are the descendants of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. It has nothing to do with the other descendants of Abram, who became what we know as the Arabs. Okay, so in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. And it came about when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch, which passed between these pieces, the pieces of these sacrifices that God sacrificed and put down there, separated them. to walk between. On that day the Lord made a great covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants, again, not all of his descendants, but these specific descendants, who were going to be 400 years in a land that was not theirs and be enslaved for 400 years. These descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. And when you look at the map and you see what that is, it's way more than just that little spot we now call Israel. They are only in a part of the promised land right now. And they're fighting over sharing it with those Arabs. But they haven't even got the half of it yet. In the end, they're going to have all the way to the river Euphrates. Will be a part of their land. And of course you say, why would they even want it? I mean, what is it? It's a desert. And by the way, the part they have now that's flourishing and green and fruitful was a desert until they moved back into it starting in the 40s. Well, actually, going back probably even to the 30s, but basically in the 40s. And it was only when the Jews got control of those portions of what we call Israel, and those parts of the land of promise that they have control over, only then did that land start to be fruitful and to flourish and be green and lush. In fact, Hal Lindsey said the first time he went over to Israel, he was actually mind-boggled. He was driving down a road that was a border road between the Israeli-controlled part of Israel and the Arab-controlled part of Israel, and the Arab-controlled part was still a barren desert. Not even a tree. And on the Israeli side, it was lush and green. God blessed the land where they were and where they are today. Blessed it and made it fruitful.
I'm just curious, I guess, as far as the river Euphrates, because that goes all the, so it's most of even landed by Iraq that will be
yeah.
part of it?
Uh-huh. Okay, okay, back to verse 18. And the day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite and the Kenizzite and the Cadmonite and the Hittite and the Perizzite, and I wonder if God laughs in heaven when he and Rephaim and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Girgashite and the Jebusite. Okay, first person to say all those words with a straight face gets a prize. Okay.
What about the parasites?
And the parasites. Okay. All right, now that's chapter 15. Now chapter 7. Where was it? Chapter 17, verses 1 through 21. It says that's not the whole chapter, but a good portion of it. It says, now when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, and I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. Now, that sounds there like it's conditional. You walk blameless, and then I'll do this. But you can't do that with that, because the promise he's talking about, the covenant he's talking about establishing between them, between him, God, and him, Abram, he's already stated he's going to do without condition. So this is not a conditional covenant. It says, and Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. Now he's talking about way more descendants than just this one nation of descendants that he's been talking about. He's talking about many nations coming out of Abram, but that doesn't equate to all being sharers in the promise or sharers in the land. But he says, you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, which means exalted father, by the way, but your name shall be called Abraham, which means father of a multitude. For I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. And I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come forth from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you. Now again, if you just took this by itself out of context of the rest of Genesis and the ultimately clear statements of who are the children of promise, it would be easy to assume that his covenant with Abram, now called Abraham, his covenant of a promised people in a promised land, and through whom all the nations of the earth and families of the earth will be blessed. You could jump to the false conclusion that the descendants that he's talking about in verse 7 are all the descendants that he's talking about, all these nations. But that's not so. It's talking about one line of descendants. Okay? Verse 8, and I will give to you and your descendants after you the land of your sojournings. See, this is talking about the descendants who will have that land as their land of promise. The land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. An everlasting possession. The land of promise, the land of Canaan, from the great river of Egypt all the way over to the river Euphrates, that whole area, that whole land is the eternal land of promise and belongs to those people of Israel. How'd they get it? How is it theirs? Because God, who created it, deeded it to them.
He says, I will be their God. So the moon god is the Arab god.
Right.
So that takes
Yep.
care of it.
The Israelites, even though they didn't always truly worship God, He is their God. They don't have a moon god like the Arabs do. Okay, the Muslims. The Muslims, in talking about, oh, we worship one God, and they call it a monotheistic faith, that is actually a lie. On the surface, the Muslim religion looks like one more monotheistic religion. Most religions are not monotheistic. Christianity and Judaism are monotheistic, and all the religious experts, they include the Muslim religion as a monotheistic religion. It actually is not. It is. It has picked one of the multiplicity of pagan gods, the moon god, as their god. So the god that they worship is actually the moon god, which is one of many pagan gods that Muhammad selected as the superior god of all the gods. So it is not, in fact, monotheistic. But you're right. This is talking about, I will be their God. Jehovah God will be their God. He's talking about the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not the rest of them. Verse 9, God further said to Abraham, now I find he's saying Abram all the time. Now I've got to start saying Abraham. It says, now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. And you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. And every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. A servant who is born into the house, or who is bought with money from any foreigner who is not your descendants. He's saying anybody in his house, anybody, servants, anybody that's in his house is to be circumcised. So actually, it's not just the Jews. Not just the Israelites. A servant who is born in your house or who is bought with money shall surely be circumcised. Thus shall my covenant be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. But an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Then God said to Abraham, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. So he changed her name from Sarai to Sarah. Sarah means he laughs. And I will bless her. We'll see later why he picked that name for her. And I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, there's the first reason why her name is called Sarah, the one with whom he is one flesh, which means he laughs, because Abram is going to laugh. We often think about the fact that Sarah laughed, and she does, but it's actually Abram in this case that's going to laugh, and that's why her name was called Sarah. Then Abram fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? Even in their day, when people lived, their lifespans have been shortened by that time compared to their ancestors and before the flood. But they're still living often well into their hundreds. And but yet, even with that, he's saying this is an old lady who's not going to have kids. And she wasn't going to have kids, that is, humanly speaking, because she's barren in the first place, and now she's way too old. Will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abram said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee." Now, we've skipped over a part of the story here, because it wasn't our purpose here to look at those other descendants. We all know that a bunch of people called Arabs have descended from Abraham. That his first son he had through the help of his wife and her unbelief, and then he went right along with her, was to have a child through her handmaid. And that child was not, in fact, the child and seed of promise. And God is underlining here later now, because this is now when, about 10 years later from the original promise, actually about 14 years later from the original promise, that it's going to be through his wife Sarah that this seed of promise is going to come, this child. And so he had Ishmael, who ended up being the father of all these Arab peoples, that were all the trouble started then and ever since. But God, he says, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee." So Abraham's still thinking that Ishmael's going to be the guy. Ishmael's the son, that's the son of promise. And he says, God said, "No, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you should call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant." I'm wrong about, I said before, I was looking at my footnotes, and I said Sarah means he laughs. I said the wrong thing. Sarah means princess. Isaac means he laughs. So Isaac was named he laughs because of Abraham laughing. "And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him." So he's saying, here we go. This now is starting to narrow it down, so there can't be any further question that the descendants of promise, the descendants who will inherit the promised land, through whom the covenant was made that his descendants will live in the land of promise, is Isaac, is the seed through which the promise is going to be fulfilled and come. "And I will establish my covenant with him," Isaac, "for an everlasting covenant with his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael," and by the way, it's not even all of his descendants. As we progress through, we're going to see that his descendants are not all a part of this line of promise. Jacob is the son that's the next one in line for promise. Jacob had a brother that didn't get in on the promise. Verse 20, "And as for Ishmael, I have heard you, and behold, I will bless him, and will make him fruitful, and I will multiply him exceedingly. He shall become the father of 12 princes, and I'll make him a great nation." Ishmael's going to become the father of 12 sons who are going to be 12 tribes of people. And I'm going to make him a great nation. "And my covenant I will establish with Isaac, but my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year." So a year from now, she's going to have this child against all human reasoning. It's obviously a natural birth, but enabled with a supernatural act. God is going to make a barren woman fruitful. And they're going to naturally have a child that's of her loins and his loins, but it's going to be a miracle because she's barren and has been all of her life and now is way beyond natural childbearing years. "And when he finished talking with him, God went up to Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son and all the servants who were born with his house, etc." Goes on to talk about that. As far as we need to go on that one right now. Now, Genesis chapter 18, verses 16 through 19. Genesis 18, 16 through 19. "Then the men rose up from there and looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham was walking with them to send them off." Now, what we're skipping is the story about how these 3 men showed up, who in fact we finally figured out are angels, okay, that have dinner with Abraham, and they're talking about what's going to happen in Sodom, etc. And says, and the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed? For I have chosen him in order that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord, by doing righteousness and justice, in order that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him. So he's talking about in the overall chapter here about what was going to happen in Sodom and Gomorrah, but he's saying, shall I let them know what I'm going to do there? But they're referring again to him being chosen, that he shall have children, descendants, that the promise is going to take place through. And again, that is that one line, that one nation. Genesis 21 now, 1 through 7. Skipping over a lot of this stuff that's going on there in Sodom and Lot's wife and all that stuff. It's not pertinent to our concerns right now. That's not to say that any portion of that scripture is not pertinent. It just isn't pertinent to our immediate discussion. Genesis chapter 21, 1 through 7. It says, Then the Lord took note of Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. That is, that this time next year you're going to have a son. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Again, which means he laughs or laughter. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, and as God had commanded him. Now, by the way, that whole thing about circumcision and being circumcised on the 8th day, what application could that possibly have for us today? Oh, that's the Old Testament, and the command to circumcise your children on the 8th day. Oh, that doesn't apply anymore. And the medical profession has gone back and forth on that. And when I was born, a lot of American male children were circumcised. But, it wasn't long before they started saying, oh, that's a waste. That hurts kids, that doesn't feel good, There's no need to do that. We don't need to circumcise. And they got away from it. And the Christians are starting to discover that we ought to be circumcising. And it turns out there's all kinds of natural benefits for health reasons that circumcision has, in addition to being a sign of the covenant between God and the descendants of Abraham, that there are all kinds of side benefits to that for the people who are circumcised. And those who choose, Gentile or otherwise, who choose to follow that instruction of the Lord, find a benefit. And they find also that the pain and the bleeding and all the other stuff that normally go along with circumcision is all minimal if done on the 8th day. There's something that's true about the 8th day circumcision. It's totally different from the experience before or after. After, especially a problem, especially if you wait till you're an adult. There's a lot of scripture about that too. In fact, some of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, some of the sons of Jacob got involved in the whole deal with getting a bunch of Gentiles circumcised so they could kill them while they were in their great pain and agony having been circumcised. And the third day they went in when they were at the peak of their pain and killed them all because they couldn't defend themselves because they're all moaning and groaning and in pain. Nevertheless, that's just a little aside that God's ways are good for all generations. And we can apply those things as believers under grace, not because we have to, but because there's a benefit to applying God's ways. Nevertheless, then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Now Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac, his son, was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So that's where Abraham Isaac came in to be is the first in this line descending from Abraham that is the line of promise and of blessing. Now Genesis 22, 14 through 18. Genesis 22, 14 through 18. It says, and Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. That's what he called this place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it will be provided. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, indeed I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens, and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. And in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Now, at first you might not know what it was talking about until I read the whole thing. What's he talking about? I'm saving time not reading the whole story. This is where God asked him to sacrifice his son Isaac, to kill him on an altar. And Abraham was willing to do it. He was willing to obey God, and he had the knife raised above him to sacrifice him when God stopped him. Now, again, the details of that are not pertinent to our primary concern here, to see the lineage. And so he's saying, no, you don't have to kill him. I wanted you to be willing to do it, but it was never God's intention for him to kill him, because he is the child of promise through whom this nation is going to come. God never intended for him to actually kill Isaac, but he wanted him to be willing to do it, because he wanted to make sure that Abraham's frame of mind was right, that he was really trusting the Lord and not putting too much stock in his son. The blessing will come through that son, but it has to be while he's trusting the Lord. So he trusted the Lord enough to actually be willing to sacrifice Isaac. And if you remember the story, Abraham said that he knew God was able to raise him up. So he figured if he sacrificed him, God would give him back to him in a resurrected state. That wasn't even God's plan. God's plan was still for him to be just a regular man who could bear children and was going to do so. And he said, I'll greatly bless you and will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of heaven and the sand of the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. The seed through the line of Abraham and Isaac, and through his seed down to Jacob, and through his seed through the 12 tribes. And then in your seed, through that line, shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Genesis 24, 1 through 9. Genesis 24, 1 through 9. Now Abraham was old, advanced in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in every way. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of the household, who had charge of all that he owned, please place your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live. So he's living among these heathen called the Canaanites, but he's saying, I don't want my son to marry one of them. But you, my servant, shall go to my country, the place he left his family in back then, where all his other relatives are, and to my relatives, and take a wife for my son Isaac. And the servant said to him, suppose the woman will not be willing to follow me to this land. So he goes, he finds just the right one. Well, what if she doesn't want to follow me to come here to marry Isaac? He says, should I take your son back to the land from where you came? So I come back, get the son, get Isaac, and take him back there to marry her? Then Abraham said to him, beware lest you take my son back there. In other words, what did God say? He says, I want you to go out to a land you don't even know, and that's where I'm going to do all this stuff. He doesn't want his son going back there. He wants him to marry one of them, one of his relatives, but he doesn't want him there. He wants him where he's supposed to be. And by the way, it was not until God gave the law to Moses that we have specific instructions in that law that we're not supposed to be marrying our near relatives. We're not supposed to be marrying brothers and sisters and cousins. Now, clearly, starting with the children of Adam and Eve, clearly down through Abraham, who was married to a half-sister, and clearly down through Isaac, who ends up marrying a cousin, and even then Jacob, who married a relative. All that's okay. Now, what's wrong with marriage, and then of course the fruit that comes out of marriage, children? What's the problem with marrying a relative and having children with a relative? When God first created mankind, they were perfect. and their genetics were perfect. But after the fall, gradually and slowly over a long period of time, the fall and sin resulted in corruption of creation and corruption of the genetic code, not radically, but just enough that is, at first it wasn't a big deal. If you took two imperfect people who were close to perfect, but still imperfect, it wasn't a problem for them to marry. It didn't really cause a problem genetically. But there's so much corruption in the genetic code by the time that of Moses' day, God put a stop to that close marriage, because when you take family members who might have these corrupted seeds in the part of the genetic code corrupted, they're likely to both have the same corruption. And when one with a corrupted seed on one part of the genetic code marries a person who doesn't have that same thing, that really is kind of like a recessive gene, and it doesn't come out. But when two with the same imperfection in the genetic code get together and combine that, then often that will manifest itself in the offspring. And that's what they say, you know, when you got today people that tend to intermarry in close family relations, you get a bunch of retards. There's all kinds of strange things. You know, they talk about these family trees of certain hillbillies, you know, looking like a telephone pole, you know, they're kind of marrying each other, staying in the family. And then there are a lot of problems, a lot of physical abnormalities and mental abnormalities. And it's so true that the law of our land in most states today, and there was a time probably it was true of all of them, they had laws against intermarriage between family members. Well, that's why God gave the law when he did, because he knew the perfect time to stop it. But prior to that, it wasn't a problem. So this is still when it's okay to be marrying family members. So this is not a justification for ignoring God's law later about marrying family members. All right, where am I? What verse did I leave off? Okay, verse 4. But you, my servant, shall go to my country, to my relatives, take a wife for my son. He says, suppose the woman won't be able to follow me, and shall I take your son back to the land from where you came? Then Abraham said, beware lest you take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, who spoke to me, who swore to me, saying, to your descendants, I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, he's saying to a servant, and you will take a wife for my son from there, bring her back. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you'll be free from this my oath. Only do not take my son back there. He's saying, swear an oath to me, you'll go get a wife for my son from among my relatives. But if she refuses to come, then you're relieved from any obligation. You don't have to, that you're done with your job. If you've tried and she won't come back, that's fine. But better not to come back with a wife than to come back and get my son and take him back there. So the servant placed his hand under the thigh of Abraham, his master, and swore to him concerning the matter. Okay, now verses 61 through 67. And you all, I think, are familiar with the story when he got there and the whole thing about he prayed to God that he the one that he was looking for would offer him water when he asked for water, and then she would just on her own be willing to water his animals, his camels. And then Rebecca was the one that came and was a beautiful girl, and the whole thing, you know, how he met her and that all happened. So now we're jumping ahead in the story to verse 61. It says, then Rebekah arose with her maids. This is after the discussion with the father and brother of Rebekah and the whole thing. But, you know, he told the whole story, and they said, oh, yeah, okay, this must be of God, you know, and whatever. They were willing to go along with it, to send her to marry her cousin, Isaac. Then Rebekah arose with her maids, and they mounted the camels and followed the man. So the servant took Rebekah and departed. Now Isaac had come from going to Bir Lahairoi, for he was living in the Negev. And Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward evening, and he lifted up his eyes, and behold, and looked, and behold, camels were coming. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel. And she said to the servant, who is this man walking in the field to meet us? And the servant said, he is my master. Then she took her veil and covered herself. And the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and Sarah, I believe, is dead by now. She's dead and buried by now. But took her into his mother Sarah's tent, and he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. Thus Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So that's how Isaac and Rebekah got together. Okay, so we've got Abraham and Isaac. Now Isaac's got a wife. Now he can have some children. Okay, Genesis 25, 1 through 6. Now Abraham took another wife. Now his first wife Sarah's dead, so now he's going to take another wife. So he's getting married again. He's an old guy. Now Isaac was 40, I believe, at the time. So now Abraham's 140. He's getting married when he's 140. What a guy. And she bore him to him, so he's now having more children with another wife. She bore to him Zimran and Jokshan and Medan and Midian and Ishbak and Shua. And Joshkan became the father of Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Asherim and Letsushim and Lumim. I admit, I don't know how to pronounce all these words. And the sons of Midian were Ephah and Epher, and I have a reason for reading all this, by the way, even though I can't pronounce their names. And Hanak and Abida and Eldah. All these were the sons of Keturah. Now Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. Now he's got all these sons now. He's got one other son by the name of Ishmael, but he is off now. He's gone. And he is not the seed of promise, and he is not inheriting anything from his father. And now he's got a bunch of other sons, but all of it goes to Isaac. Here's where a bunch more people are coming from that are among the nations, the great many nations of people coming out of the seeds of Abraham, out of the loins of Abraham. But it's still only through the son of promise, the miraculous son of promise, Isaac, that the promises are going to be fulfilled and the land is going to be passed along to him. Now Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines Abraham gave gifts while he was still living, and sent them away. He gave them some gifts, but there's no real inheritance there. Sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the land of the east. And all these, and these are all the years of Abraham's life that he lived, 175 years. He lived 175 years and then he died. But you notice there's a bunch of other relies, a bunch of other kids that coming out of Abraham. Abraham became the father of many nations, but none of them were the nation of promise and were the chosen nation except for the one, through Abraham, Isaac, and then ultimately Jacob, which we're going to have to wait to get to next week. Now let me just finish in chapter 25 with verses 19 through 34, if I can quickly do that. Now these are the records of the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padam Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren, and the Lord answered him. And Rebekah, his wife, conceived, but the children struggled together within her. And she said, "If it is so, why then am I this way?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 people shall be separated from your body. And one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. She's having twins, and normally the older twin, at least in the old days, would be the one through whom the descendancy would follow, through the inheritance would go primarily, and would be the leader, would be the one that authority would be vested in. But God is saying to her that it's her younger son that will be served by the older. When her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. Now the first came forth, red all over like a hairy garment, and they named him Esau. And afterwards his brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob, which means one who takes the heel or supplants. And Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them. When the boys grew up, Esau became a skilled hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a peaceful man living in tents. Now Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for game. Different kind of personality than Jacob, but Rebekah loved Jacob. He was a mama's boy. And when Jacob had cooked stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was famished. And Esau said to Jacob, please let me have a swallow of that red stuff there, for I am famished. Therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, first sell me your birthright. Now we're going to stop right there because we're out of time. But we're going to pick that up next week. But here's these two sons. It's going to be Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because the older son sells his birthright. Now, it was in the plan of God that would be. But we'll see more of that and how we progress down through this one nation of people, the Israelites. We're out of time. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for what you're showing us here, and the great blessing it is to see how you work to bring all these things to pass, and that you have indeed got a plan for your chosen